So, okay, although Jane Eyre was published openly as fiction, the subtitle, an autobiography, brings out the usefulness of viewing it through autobiography theory. Two of the terms often used in discussing autobiography are the concepts of autonomous self and relational self, both useful for looking at Jane Eyre. As the theories of Georges Gustorf, Paul-Jean Eken, and Michael Bakhtin help clarify, Bronte's dialogical voices, particularly those of patriarchal classist society, as well as those of Jane's complex emerging identity, delineate the development of Jane Eyre's multifaceted, autonomous, and relational self. These other men think it's one or the other, and I'm saying both are crucial here. Gustorf, often called the founder of autobiography theory, defines development of an autonomous self as a crucial criterion of this literary genre. Though he refers to it only in men's autobiography, it is central in Jane Eyre as well. Gustorf asserts that autobiography emerged only in relatively recent Western civilization because of our civilization's focus on the importance of the individual, rather than on importance as a part of a whole community or culture. It seems useful to adopt as a working definition of autonomous self Gustorf's idea of the singularity of each individual life. Interestingly, Gustorf's concept of the autonomous self evoked ire in many readers because of his insistence on talking about white male autobiographers. One of these readers is Eken, who calls Gustorf's criterion the myth of autonomy, claiming that the self, and thus autobiography, can only be, quote, defined by its relations with others, superseding the notion of much feminist criticism that female autobiography is simply different from male because it's relational and male is autonomous. Eken claims convincingly that all autobiography is inherently relational and that narrative is, quote, a principal mode in which relational identity is formed and transacted. I'm going to read that quote again because I love that. He says that narrative is a principal mode in which relational identity is formed and transacted. What Eken does not seem to recognize, however, is the possibility that the correctness of his theory need not completely preclude the idea of a strongly individual or autonomous self. He seems to assume Gustorf's definition of autonomous includes independence from others, rather than a strongly independent self brought to consciousness and defined through relationships with others. As a working definition of relational self, it seems appropriate to use Eken's definition of a self, quote, defined by its relation with others. Both autonomous and relational self theories speak to the development of identity in Jane Eyre. Her character does fit Gustorf's emphatically individualistic mode, featuring a separate and unique selfhood, but that autonomous selfhood is created and defined in terms of her relationships with others, rather than being defined by her ability to live independently of other people. Bronte shows Jane struggling, changing, and developing as a direct result of her interactions and relationships. Especially useful in suggesting how this operates in the novel is Bakhtin's notion of authoritative discourse and internally persuasive discourse. Although he acknowledges that these two types of discourse may exist simultaneously, he says that they usually do not. Quote, it happens more frequently that an individual's becoming, an ideological process, is characterized precisely by a sharp gap between these two categories. In one, the authoritative word, religious, political, moral, the word of a father, of adults, of teachers, etc., that does not know internal persuasiveness. In the other, internally persuasive word that is denied all privilege, backed up by no authority at all. In Jane's case, both patriarchal norms and classist norms function as authoritative discourse, never becoming completely internally persuasive for her, but forcing her to struggle with them from the time she is a young girl till she is a married woman. Neither the autonomous model nor the relational model adequately explains Jane's identity development. in the same way that Lacan's mirror stage describes a person's coming to consciousness of self gradually through repeated encounters with his or her own image, Bakhtin's discussion of dialogical voices, and that's a long word, but just think of it, voices in dialogue with each other, okay? Within societies and within individuals, is a useful way of describing Jane Eyre's coming of age through relationships. Although on the surface, Jane's beginning life among well-off middle-class people and eventually attaining this status herself could seem to promote the ideology of the patriarchal classist society in which the story takes place, the text functions dialogically to simultaneously support and undermine that ideology. First of all, Jane is born of a middle-class mother and is partly raised in the moneyed middle-class home of her relatives, causing her to think of herself as belonging to that class, even while she's hopelessly bewildered as to her actual identity and where she belongs. As a young child, with only conjectures of the working class she is reacting against, she responds with horror to the thought of becoming a poor child when Mr. Lloyd, the apothecary, suggests the idea of her moving to live with less well-off relatives as an antidote to the hateful, stifling upbringing among the moneyed Reeds. From the vantage point of the older Jane, we learn, quote, "Poverty looks grim to grown people, still more to children. They have not much idea of industrious, working, respectable poverty. Poverty for me was synonymous with degradation. No, I was not heroic enough to purchase liberty at the price of caste," end quote. We see here that Jane still blindly accepts the classist authoritative discourse, but as years pass and she develops her strong sense of self through relationships, she realizes the folly of her young prejudices. Here she is struggling to see herself and cannot, because authoritative discourse gives her a false vision of herself as valueless. She looks at herself in a mirror grimed by the classist patriarchal vision, denigrating her as a human being. She needs interaction with various individuals to help clear her vision of this patriarchal classist grime. Where her own internally persuasive anti-classist and anti-patriarchal discourse begins to shine through and to influence a more positive sense of identity is in her final conflict with her Aunt Reed before her aunt sends her away. As Jane's rage bubbles to the surface, she forces her aunt to see, for a moment, not only how she has mistreated Jane, but also how Aunt Reed herself is deluded. Jane reminds her aunt that having money will never make her cousins inherently better than Jane, and that her aunt's only power comes from being the instrument of her dead husband, whose wishes she is trying to thwart. It is through this interaction with her aunt, even more powerfully than through the various mirrored images she has just seen of herself in the Red Room, that Jane becomes aware of her power as an individual, and that she begins to realize that authoritative discourse does not have to be internally persuasive. She realizes that though society would see her behavior here as grossly inappropriate, she nevertheless has the power to speak up about what is internally persuasive to her. As Sandra Gilbert insightfully comments, quote, "Jane's retrospective, 'something spoke out of me,' is as frightening as the arrogance, suggesting the dangerous double consciousness that brought on the fit in the Red Room," end quote. While Gilbert sees this as a clear precursor to the possibility of more than momentary madness, I maintain that it is also evidence of a very human struggle for ideological consciousness and autonomous self. Although it will take many years for Jane to realize fully, this raging interaction with her aunt opens her eyes to the power of her rebellion against the system, thus providing her with a new image of her own identity. Ironically, while this self-knowledge does not come to her in solitude, but in the process of relating to another person, it earns her a greater sense of autonomous self than she formerly possessed and than she could have achieved on her own. In the Lowood years, Jane's conflict is not as much with classist as with patriarchal ideology. As she desperately attempts to grow to be a person admirable to herself, the dialogical voices of her Christian but patriarchal society and the voices of her liberty-seeking self strive for dominance. Voices around her, Helen, Miss Temple, Mr. Brocklehurst, and others are saying, "Be good," while a voice within her is saying, "Be yourself." Her ongoing struggle is with how to assimilate the elements of patriarchal Christian society she finds appropriate while rejecting the Brocklehurstian elements she finds despicable. In this process, Miss Temple, with her refined, gracious treatment of the girls, is an exception to the rule of disagreeable, conceited middle and upper class women in Jane's experience. She is for Jane a positive embodiment of both classist and patriarchal authoritative discourse. She becomes Jane's mother figure and role model, a woman as angel in the house, convincing Jane to aspire to be as good and as gracious as possible. Ironically, because the beloved Miss Temple's complicity, because of her complicity in Brocklehurst's oppressive system, even some Brocklehurstian elements survive in Jane's identity. Gina Politi has a partially valid point when she says, quote, "Mr. Brocklehurst's mission, which was to mortify in these girls the lusts of the flesh, to teach them to clothe themselves with shamefacedness and sobriety, not with braided hair and costly apparel, fully succeeded with Jane Eyre," end quote. Brocklehurst's imprint on Jane's character was definitely a permanent sobriety and plainness of dress. Those of you who've read the book remember that she refused even to wear a beautiful dress, refused to let her husband to be buy her beautiful wedding dress, but never shamefacedness. And yet, even this imprint would not have been possible without Miss Temple's influence working for him. If it had been only the conflict between Jane's internally persuasive voice rebelling against Mr. Brocklehurst's hypocritical authoritative voice, his would have had no chance of permanent effect on the formation of her identity. It is precisely because of the complicating factor of Miss Temple as the admired embodiment of these aspects of his ideology that his ideology is partially effective for Jane. Thus, it is relationality which establishes its power over Jane's identity formation. When Miss Temple leaves the school to marry, however, Jane appears to shake off her spell of compliance, realizing, quote, "My mind had put off all it had borrowed of Miss Temple, or rather that she had taken with her the serene atmosphere I'd been breathing in her vicinity, and that now I was left in my natural element and beginning to feel the stirring of old emotions," end quote. However, even though Jane thinks her mind put off all it borrowed of Miss Temple, her character keeps much of the imprint of Miss Temple's gracious concern for morality, her obedience to men, and her extreme respect for propriety for the rest of her life. Jane even imitates her role model in finally marrying an excellent man, almost worthy of such a wife. Although she does not continue the relationship with Miss Temple throughout her adulthood, this relationship and the way it raises the issue of complicity or non-complicity with patriarchy significantly affect the formation of Jane's autonomous identity in a permanent way. Another person Jane's character retains a lifelong imprint of is her young friend Helen Burns, whose legacy is a true trust in God. Until meeting her, Jane seems to have had no significant contact with genuine Christian faith or the idea of a God who loves her, although she has had much contact with the church. But Helen's words exhorting Jane to forgive, to return good for evil, and to live not for the approval of people, but for reward from God are powerfully reinforced by the strength of her example. But here again, we see the dialogical functioning of various discourses as Jane repeatedly remonstrates with Helen that she needs to defend herself. When we are struck at without a reason, we should strike back again very hard. I am sure we should. So hard as to teach the person who struck us never to do it again. Helen's behavior as she receives one unjust punishment after another is particularly striking to Jane. How can she bear it so quietly? She looks as if she were thinking of something beyond her punishment. Jane learns what Helen is thinking of when in a later conversation, Helen explains her concern that human relationality is more important to Jane than it ought to be. Quote, "Hush, Jane, you think too much of the love of human beings. God waits only the separation of spirit from flesh to crown us with a full reward," end quote. It's the powerful example of this honest life and love, as well as the words of Jane's fatally ill friend, quote, "I believe, I have faith, I am going to God," end quote, which affect Jane powerfully. As she emulates Helen's faith and turns to God for guidance, the effect on her character and identity is powerful. Although she always retains her strong will, Jane grows into a person who thinks about pleasing God in resisting temptation, wishes desperately that God would take her to heaven, and expresses Helen-like faith in her time of utter need. Quote, "I can but die, and I believe in God. Let me try to wait his will in silence," end quote. Because of Helen's and Jane's love for each other, Helen's Christian faith, even as an embodiment of part of authoritative discourse, becomes permanently internally persuasive for Jane, where the faith of Mr. Brocklehurst and his ilk is not. Once Jane leaves Lowood to move to Thornfield, her strong autonomous self is clearly recognizable, already substantially formed by the dialogical interactions of various classist and patriarchal voices within her own complex, often resisting internal voice. Edward Rochester recognizes his singularity as he first meets her, commenting a little later, "You have rather the look of another world. I marveled where you had got that sort of face. When you came on me in Hay Lane last night, I thought unaccountably of fairy tales and had half a mind to demand whether you had bewitched my horse." He recognizes not just physical unusualness, but a power in her singular identity or autonomous self to which he is powerfully drawn. During Jane's time at Thornfield, the dialogical forces that have been at work forming her character continue to challenge her multifaceted identity and strengthen her character traits through times of severe testing. One area of severe testing for Jane is her odd relationship to Grace Poole and Bertha Rochester, whose identities Rochester intentionally and Jane unknowingly conflate, so that in Gilbert's words, the caretaker is the mad woman's public representative. What becomes clear as the novel progresses is that both women are connected to Jane intimately and exemplifying what she is both repressing and trying to avoid becoming. The one Jane comes into contact with first is in Susan Freeman's words, I love this quote too, "the underglossed Grace Poole whose lousy job has driven her to drink," end quote. Wondering and worrying about this unusual woman caused Jane to question her own identity. After the night Jane rescues Rochester from being burned to death by Grace Poole, as she assumes, Jane is shocked to hear Grace implicate her in the affair, as she herself is trying to verify Grace's guilt. She paused and then added in a marked and significant tone, "But you are young, miss, and I should say a light sleeper. Perhaps you may have heard a noise?" Although superficially these words simply add a note of mystery to the affair, they actually demonstrate how similar the positions of Grace and Jane are in terms of the two women's inscrutability and social invisibility to most of the household. Trying to ascertain why Rochester would keep on and support a servant she believes is a liability to him, Jane wonders if Rochester is trying to repay her for sexual favors in former days. She thinks of, quote, Mrs. Poole's square, flat figure and uncomely, dry, even coarse face. "No, impossible. My supposition cannot be correct." "Yet," suggested the secret voice which talks to us in our own hearts, "you are not beautiful either, and perhaps Mr. Rochester approves you," end quote. As Jane tries to ascertain Grace's character and position in the house, she is also assaying her own worth and position, alternately acceding to and rebelling against the voice of authoritative classist discourse in her ear. She does not want to see herself in this working class woman, yet she cannot ignore the comparison. Jane cannot resist the knowledge that in the social hierarchy she has no great superiority over Grace, and she fears becoming what she believes Grace is. An even more obvious comparison, however, exists between Jane and Rochester's mad first wife. Gilbert notes with incisive brilliance, "Bertha, is Jane's truest and darkest double, the angry aspect of the orphan child, the ferocious secret self Jane has been trying to repress ever since her days at Gateshead, end quote. Though as a child, Jane lets her anger out at Aunt Reed powerfully, she describes her mind immediately afterward as black and blasted after the flames of rebellious passion are spent. In spite of her independent spirit, she is in the throes of remorse for what society's authoritative discourse tells her is unseemly conduct. After that crucial moment, Jane knows the havoc her free passions could wreak and is careful to keep them in check, finding internally persuasive the elements of authoritative discourse that teach her the importance of compliance, self-discipline, and propriety. In Lowood, she learns careful self-discipline, and at Thornfield, she demonstrates her propriety by going to the uninhabited roof before expressing her restless longings, quote, for a power of vision which might overpass that limit of what is within her reach, end quote. Bertha, on the other hand, has unlearned such restraint through her madness, symbolically warning Jane of a similar fate if she lets her own passions go unchecked. While Gilbert is powerfully convincing in connecting Bertha's outbreaks to occasions of Jane's own times of repressed anger and rebellion, she misses the mark when she interprets Jane's violent quotation from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount as stemming from her disguised hostility to Rochester. To understand the intended meaning of the passage, it's necessary to listen to Jane's inner dialogue, the struggle of disparate voices within her, and to recognize that for her, the words of the Bible are not oppressive, authoritative discourse, but internally persuasive discourse. As she struggles with the voices of passion, love for Rochester, and conscience, a voice within me, she calls it, Jane says that her, quote, conscience turned tyrant, held passion by the throat, told her tauntingly she had yet but dipped her dainty foot in the slough, and swore that with that arm of iron he would thrust her down to unsounded depths of agony. Let me be torn away then, I cried. Let another help me. No, you shall tear yourself away. None shall help you. You shall yourself pluck out your right eye, yourself cut off your right hand. Your heart shall be the victim, and you the priest to transfix it, end quote. This is perhaps the most powerful example of the dialogical voices of the novel, demonstrating that even authoritative discourse, which has become internally persuasive, as is the case with Jane's conscience's speech to her about the need for moral uprightness, has the ability to move temporarily back into the realm of personally unpersuasive authoritative discourse, forcing the dialogue to continue. Jane's struggle is to maintain it as internally persuasive despite the violent upheaval of contesting voices within her. It's interesting to note here that Jane Rochester as narrator highlights the intensity of the dialogical struggle going on by switching to third-person narrative in mid-paragraph. You may have found it confusing as I read it, like, why is it sometimes I and sometimes she? She switches midway to allow herself to personify both conscience and passion. By personifying conscience as a tyrannical male and passion as a dainty female, she expresses both antipathy toward her conscience and mockery of her passion, forcing her readers to see the strength of the forces operating within her and within society. Her conscience is bringing out the heavy artillery, the words of Jesus, to remind her that it is better to be physically maimed than to lose her life spiritually. These words are in no way a wish, subconscious or conscious, for harm to befall her beloved Rochester. Yet her words are also prophetic, as Rochester finally experiences the poetic justice of the physical punishment associated with preventing the sin he allowed himself to succumb to repeatedly. Symbolically, his loss of hand and eyes represents his act of penance for the adultery he knows as morally wrong and as ultimately harmful. His later partially regaining of his sight reinforces this idea of penance by calling attention to the fact that true repentance is rewarded spiritually and sometimes physically. Since the primary conflict Jane faces at Thornfield is whether or not to accept Rochester's love on his terms, her situation here encapsulates two ongoing conflicts of the novel. If she were to choose to accept his offer of love, either as Rochester's illegal second wife or as his mistress, Jane would be allowing the male-dominated social order to label her as inferior. Her rejection of his offer is, among other things, a rejection of such a patriarchal system. What Jane is simultaneously rejecting, however, is the subtle implication that she, a governess, and by definition between social classes, has no power to resist the offer of love from someone so high above her socially. As Mrs. Fairfax says to Jane wonderingly and warningly, gentlemen in his situation are not accustomed to marry their governesses. Jane, nevertheless, does resist class pressure by choosing not to accept him on his terms, knowing no semblance of equality could exist between them in such a union, and that it would be wrong because of his first wife. What she is also resisting, which is even stronger than the power of Rochester's entreaties, is the voice of her own hungry soul. Her soul hungry for that true, respectful love of another human being, which she has sought her whole life. In this situation, however, she knows that the voice she must follow is that of her conscience, the portion of the Christian authoritative discourse that for her has become internally persuasive. Though her conscience tells her what she must do, she describes her decision-making process as an ordeal. Quote, terrible moment, full of struggle, blackness, burning. Not a human being that ever lived could wish to be loved better than I was loved. And him who thus loved me, I absolutely worshipped, and I must renounce love and idol, end quote. Naming the strident dialogical voices within her as conscience, reason, and feeling, Jane recounts her indomitable reply to Rochester. She talks herself into obeying the highest good, knowing it will mean great loss to herself and to Rochester. And here comes my favorite quote from the book, and perhaps from literature of all times. I will respect myself. I will keep the law given by God, sanctioned by men. I will hold to the principles received by me when I was sane and not mad as I am now. Laws and principles are not for the times when there is no temptation. They are for times such as this, when body and soul rise in mutiny against their rigor. Stringent are they, inviolate they shall be. If at my individual convenience I might break them, what would be their worth? End quote. Isn't that a great quote? Oh. At Thornfield, it would have been easy for Jane to have oversimplified her choices, rationalizing that a girl of her background and advantages would never receive as good an offer again as Mr. Rochester's. Yet as Jane's dialogical struggle with classism and patriarchy has taught her, ethical choices are not simple. Though she knows her own comfort and happiness are important, and she knows that being able to give comfort and solace to the lonely Mr. Rochester whom she loves is also a great good, she sees as the higher good the ability to follow the divine law, which will in turn keep her self-respect intact. She is also savvy enough to know that even if marrying Rochester has the possibility of dulling his passion for her, surely living with him outside of marriage would do that even more so. The ending of the novel in particular, with Jane functioning as both Rochester's social equal now that she has her competency and as his caretaker because of his great physical need, is a particularly telling way to express the dialogical forces which have formed Jane's character. Jane is, in Terry Eagleton's words, an extraordinarily contradictory amalgam of smoldering rebelliousness and prim conventionalism, gushing romantic fantasy and canny hard-headedness, quivering sensitivity and blunt rationality, end quote. I'm out of time, so I have to skip down to the end, sorry. Okay, let's see. In this novel, neither completely wins, producing Jane's multifaceted, ambivalent, but autonomous identity. This process creates a strong thinking individual who is too complex to be pigeonholed. This novel is a wonderful example of the many voices involved in the dialogical process of coming to ideological consciousness, demonstrating irony and pain as Jane Eyre develops a strong but complex autonomous self through relationships. Thank you.